Okay, so now I have the opportunity to introduce another amazing speaker that we've asked to join us today, and that's Andrea Ritchie. Andrea is a Black lesbian immigrant police misconduct attorney and organizer whose writing, litigation, and advocacy has focused on policing and criminalization of women and LGBT people of color for the past 2 decades. Andrea provides leadership to inspire us to think about a world without relying on the criminal legal system. And I was so inspired when we spoke to Andrea in preparation for the conference, and we were ecstatic when we were able to get her to make time in her busy schedule to be with us. And so with that, I would love to welcome Andrea.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I'm Andrea Ritchie. I am coming to you today from the land of the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi people. I am a very light-skinned Black woman with green eyes, blue glasses, and sitting in front, curly hair, and sitting in front of a green background for the 2021 National Sexual Assault Conference. I'm feeling deeply grounded and moved by Lydia and Jamia's presentations. It's an honor to be here speaking with them, and I'm a huge fan of both of their work and have learned so much from both of them. So I'm feeling, yes, sort of shaky as I begin, and very much tempted to just say what Lydia said and leave it there. But I, as Sandra said, come to you as a Black lesbian woman, immigrant, and I say those things because they're not always apparent from looking at me, but they deeply inform the work that I do. And I also come to you as a survivor who sought but did not find safety from police or systems that are advanced as places of safety, and whose primary experience of sexual violence came from police. I also come to you as an advocate for survivors who began this work as part of a national women's organization in Canada. And I was remembering in my conversation with David and Sandra in preparation for this plenary that one of the first things I remember doing as an advocate around sexual assault was seeking to influence a law around criminalization of stalking. And I think the idea was that we wanted to increase visibility of this particular form and precursor of sexual violence and increase accountability through this lens of understanding that, you know, our value or the value of experiences that we have is measured by how long someone does in a cage for harming us. And there were many of us as Black women and women of color in that organization who were uncomfortable with that position, who knew that for us, safety had never come through the criminal punishment system, that for us, the criminal punishment system was a source of violence, family separation, criminalization, deprivation, humiliation. And so it was a profound discomfort in sort of trying to advance more criminalization as a solution. And that only grew when, as someone who was on the board of a shelter for unhoused women and survivors of domestic violence, I was asked to participate in an audit of the Toronto Police Service's responses to sexual violence. This was in the late 90s, following a case brought by a white woman who went by the name Jane Doe, whose brutal sexual assault by a serial rapist was not prevented in any way by police. In fact, was facilitated by the fact that they did nothing to prevent it or warn her or other potential victims of the likelihood that they would be assaulted by this person. And essentially, a court found that the police service used her and other women as bait to catch this serial rapist. And so in an instance, which is basically the one that we're taught on TV through Law and Order and countless movies and TV shows, is the reason we need police to prevent sexual violence, to prevent serial killers, to keep us safe from serial killers. The police spectacularly showed that that wasn't what they were about or what they were doing. And so the city's response was to say, well, let's audit the Toronto Police Department to find out what they could be doing better to respond to sexual violence. And as community organizers who were involved in that audit, what quickly became apparent was that police were not protecting anyone from sexual assault, but they were perpetrating it. And not just in isolated incidents, but systemically. And that the very resource or service or institution that was being lifted up as a source of safety was in fact systematically not only denying people safety, but perpetrating the very forms of violence it's being funded and lifted up to address. So I'm going to share this. I don't know why I can't find what I'm looking for here. Some information and also sort of resources that have guided me in this work going forward. I'm happy to, I think links will be dropped in the chat so you can see some of these resources for yourself. But these realizations, these experiences brought me to the work of Insight, where I had the privilege of serving on the National Steering Committee for 5 years, and to bring that work of documenting sexual violence and other forms of violence by police against people like myself and other people in my community through a toolkit, and later documented in Invisible No More, which is a book that examines policing, criminalization, and mass incarceration through the lens of the experiences of Black women, women of color, and queer and trans people of color. And this journey that I'm describing very briefly brought me to be one of the leaders of the movement to defund and abolish police and policing, and to be doing that work as a survivor with other survivors who are Black and Indigenous and queer and trans and disabled and migrants, who want more and better options for survivors like ourselves and each other than are currently being offered by the system that we have invested and continue to invest $100 billion a year into, with very unsatisfactory results. So I don't think I need to tell anyone that criminalization has not stopped or reduced sexual violence, in spite of the fact that we continue to increase our investments every year. I don't think I need to tell anyone here that police do nothing to prevent sexual violence. At best, they respond after the fact. I don't think I need to tell anyone here that punishment doesn't prevent sexual violence. It only moves it behind prison walls where we can't see it. That criminalization doesn't equal accountability. The vast majority of people who engage in sexual violence are never held accountable. Some of them become the president or Supreme Court justices. And that most importantly, prisons do not transform the conditions that produce violence in the ways that Lydia was just describing in such eloquent and great detail. In fact, it perpetuates the conditions that produce violence by looting the resources we need to advance equity and reduce sexual violence. The things that you've heard over the last day are more effective and essential to preventing and ending sexual violence: housing, healthcare, accessible, sustainable, living wage employment, and income support without the need of producing in the capitalist society, childcare, elder care, disabled care for disabled people, transportation, and more. So those topics have been covered and will be covered through the rest of the conference. What I will focus on today is the fact that criminalization not only doesn't prevent or reduce sexual violence, it perpetrates sexual violence. And that is part of the reason that 70% of survivors choose not to report their sexual assault to the police. And one of the reasons is that 80% of survivors know who sexually assaulted them and don't necessarily want them to do time in a cage. They want the violence to stop. They want accountability, acknowledgement, and healing, but they're not getting that from the system. And so by definition, the current approach that we are taking is leaving the vast majority of survivors behind, not to mention the people that we don't even see as survivors of sexual violence. So There are many reasons people aren't relying on police or reporting sexual assault to police or using the current system, but one of the central ones is that criminalization is not offering them the things that they need and that we as survivors need. And that is particularly true for Black women, for Indigenous women, for queer or Black survivors, queer survivors, trans survivors, disabled survivors, migrant survivors, criminalized survivors, and many others for whom the more likely response of a criminal punishment system and policing is criminalization of the survivor, violence against survivors, rather than healing and safety, and that's been the case historically by law and continues to be the case by fact. And before we get into, well, maybe we can fix this by training, the answer is not better or more police training. The reasons people aren't using the system is because the system isn't delivering what they want, and it wasn't set up to deliver what they want. And what it was set up to do is to police, punish, cage, and control the survivors who aren't able to access it now. So you all heard the story yesterday that Mariam shared about the fact that there's one hamburger stand in the middle of the desert, which is the current system, and that 80% of survivors would rather drive by that hamburger stand and starve than use it. And so as sexual assault survivors and sexual assault advocates and people who want to end sexual violence, we have to attend to that fact. We have to also recognize that criminalization in and of itself is a form of sexual violence. It perpetrates sexual violence. It makes sexual violence possible. And that is what I've been calling the missing story of Me Too. Me Too has been used to advance more criminal punishment, to call for harsher laws, to do the thing that I was doing in my 20s, say we need more laws, we need longer laws, we need more punishment. When in fact, as we felt in my 20s, and is still true now, for Black survivors and the folks who originated Me Too, the answer is healing, support, and transforming the conditions that make the violence possible to make it no longer possible. That's what Tarana Burke was seeking to create. And if we expand the frame through which we understand these issues to center survivors who are Black, disabled, queer, trans, migrant, Indigenous, then we will see the importance of addressing that response and taking a different path. That the silence around sexual violence experienced by marginalized, criminalized populations is particularly pronounced when we're talking about sexual violence that takes place in the context of policing, criminalization, and punishment. So at Interrupting Criminalization, we put together some resources for all of you as sexual assault advocates, people who care about preventing and ending sexual violence. One is a report and the other is a curriculum. And we hope that you will use these to break the silences that Jamia talked about that exist around sexual violence by police, sexual violence that is an inherent part of criminalization, and sexual violence that is not stopped by policing and criminalization, but rather perpetrated by it. And we hope that you will do that and understand that this is not an individual problem. You may have heard of sexual violence by police through the experience of Joanne Little. You may have heard of sexual violence experienced by Fannie Lou Hamer when she was arrested for desegregating a lunch counter. You may have heard of the case of Tiawanda Moore, who was a survivor of domestic violence, who one of the responding officers sexually assaulted her. And then when she went to report that, she was criminalized, and the officer who sexually assaulted her suffered no consequences. You may have heard of Black women sexually assaulted by former Oklahoma City police officer Daniel Holtzclaw, whose stories were lifted up by Jenny Leggins and many other survivors who came forward. You may have heard the story of Sharnezia Corley, who was subjected to a physical body cavity search in full public view by police outside a gas station in Houston, who claimed that they caught a whiff of marijuana when she was pulled over in a traffic stop. You may have heard of Black women being strip searched, cavity searched, and sexually violated at the border under suspicion of carrying drugs. You may have heard of migrants being raped by Border Patrol as they attempt to enter the United States. or you may have heard of Anna Chambers. However you came to the idea that police don't protect us from sexual violence, but actually perpetrate it, I want to leave you with the understanding that these were not isolated incidents, that these are pervasive and inherent to policing, that sexual violence is the second most frequently reported form of police misconduct after excessive force, that an officer is caught in an act of sexual violence every 5 days. And those are the ones who are caught, which everyone, including law enforcement, agree is just to the tip of the iceberg. Former Seattle Police Chief Norm Stamper calls sexual violence by police law enforcement's nasty little secret. Former Portland, Oregon Police Chief Penny Harrington talks about the culture of law enforcement being one that perpetuates and supports sexual violence by law enforcement. No one could say it more blatantly than this former officer who was assigned to the Child Abuse and Sex Crimes Investigations Unit. So I just really want to emphasize that this is not something we can fix. This is not something that is a question of rogue officers. This is inherent to policing. This is inherent to criminalization. That literally one of the corollaries of criminalization is that you can do anything to the people who are criminalized, including violate them sexually. And that in fact, police sexual violence is a tool of policing. It is part of policing. And so it happens across the country in many contexts, in the context of traffic stops, in the context of youth engagement programs. And we've seen this recently in New York and Boston and other places. It happens when police are stationed in schools. It happens when police community engagement programs are offered as solutions to rebuild community trust. In fact, those are sites where sexual violence by police is quite prevalent. It happens in the context of policing of prostitution and trafficking in epidemic proportions. And I always like to use this chart that was created by young researchers in the from Young Women's Empowerment Project, who documented the things that young people were reporting, young people in the sex trades were reporting as sources of violence in their lives. And you'll see the biggest piece of the pie is the blue piece, and that represents police. And what this chart says to me is that we are putting all of our money and all of our resources and all of the legitimacy and all of our eggs into the basket of the biggest piece of the source of harm to young people in the sex trades in order to address harm by people who they describe as the smallest piece of harm, the people we think of as, you know, the perpetrators, the people we think of as doing harm. And so I just can't emphasize enough that policing is a source of violence for people who we think of or who they portray themselves as protecting. I also can't emphasize enough that policing of gender and sexuality, like policing of ability and disability, and policing of race and nation and poverty and class are all inherent to policing. It's about maintaining all of the relations of power that Lydia described, and that sexual violence by police is a tool for doing that. And where trans women are experiencing epidemic forms of violence, including fatal violence across the country, they still say, like the young people in the sex trades in Chicago who were part of Young Women Empowerment Project, that the most dangerous thing out here is the police. So the drug war is another primary site of sexual violence by police. Broken windows policing, which is basically policing of public spaces and policing of what police perceive as order. And for those of us who are perceived to be inherently disorderly, which is Black folks, Indigenous folks, disabled folks, gender non-conforming, queer, trans folks, and migrants, that means our experiences are being policed and presence are being policed every day. Essentially, sexual violence by law enforcement takes place anywhere officers have power over people, including during calls for help. And so one of the primary targets of sexual violence by law enforcement are survivors, and that is an intentional and inherent part of policing and relying on police as response. 70% of cases involve either traffic stops, youth, or survivors. That's particularly true for trans folks, for homeless and low-income folks, and for disabled folks. For Black folks, for young people. For people who are or are profiled as being involved in the drug or sex trades. And what we do about police sexual violence, I want to just note, is often we're like, well, let's double down. Let's just criminalize more. Let's make sure that we criminalize the cops who do this. Let's close the consent loophole. I just want to say that that will do nothing to prevent police sexual violence because it is inherent to policing in and of itself. So very few folks come forward. Remember that 80% of people who don't ever report sexual assault to cops in the first place, that number is infinitely greater. That proportion is infinitely greater for those of us who were sexually assaulted by the people that we're supposed to report it to. So they also deliberately target people who they know or think will not be believed if they come forward. Even if people do report it, they rarely continue because they are discouraged from doing so. They are attacked from doing so. And if they do, they have to be believed. The case must be investigated. It must be sustained. It must be taken forward to trial. And only then, which is now a very tiny percentage of cases, the officer has to say, oh, she consented. And that's the only point at which the consent defense is relevant. It's really a red herring. It doesn't actually deal with the issue, but what it does do is it legitimates the system that perpetrates, condones, and perpetuates and promotes police sexual violence. It relies on the idea that if we just punish it, it'll go away when sexual violence is inherent to policing. So there are many things that we can do, and I want to leave you all with this charge of what you can be doing yourselves around making sure that survivors of police sexual violence are not left behind. And one is just collecting information about it, raising public awareness, making sure that your programs offer support and healing specifically to survivors of sexual violence by police that don't send them back to the police for accountability, support, or healing, making sure that you are focused on prevention and detection and accountability. And I would say that for me and for many folks, before I say that, in the curriculum that we offer, there are ways in which you can participate in doing these things. We offer suggestions about how to do that, and also how you can respond to initiatives in your community in ways that will reduce, not increase, sexual violence by police. There are ways that we can look at the whole system and decide that, in fact, we have invested legitimacy, resources into a system that is not ending, hasn't prevented, hasn't interrupted, hasn't ended sexual violence, but in fact is perpetrating it. And then we can move beyond statements to rectifying the situation by upending the system, by saying this is no longer working. We want better and more for ourselves and for survivors. And that is what is behind folks like myself and others who are calling for defunding and abolishing the police in the ways towards a world that is informed by the disability justice framework that Lydia described, and in ways that will ultimately create safety for all of us. And if you don't feel able to go all that way, there are ways that you can still go some steps along the way that will reduce sexual violence and increase safety for all of us. Ensuring that you reduce the power, tools, and opportunity of police to engage in sexual violence, that you join programs to decriminalize, to defund police, to remove police from public spaces, and that you work to build different responses to sexual violence that don't involve police. That you say this is not working and we need to figure out what we can build instead. Whether that's community accountability, there's toolkits for that, whether that's alternate responses to mental health crises that don't involve police, and that also focus on mental health crisis prevention and not just responding in a moment of crisis, whether it's building individual conversations in your community, family, or neighborhood that can interrupt and prevent and address sexual abuse like the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective has done, whether it's the ideas that are available on the Transform Harm website. The thing that's essential to remember is that there's not going to be one solution. that we're going to need to engage in a million experiments to find our way to safety for each of us in the particular ways that we experience violence and the particular ways that safety looks to all of us. And we're not going to get there through a one-size-fits-all solution, which is likely to leave as many survivors behind as the current solution. So take our guidance from survivors of violence at many intersections, like the Young Women's Freedom Center, who have offered us a freedom charter forward. And remember that there's a long way to go and there's much to be done, but that the valor is in recognizing that the path we've been on is not preventing sexual violence, it's perpetrating it. And the valor is stopping and choosing a different path forward that will ensure safety for all survivors. Thank you.